Political party, the National Convention can be the biggest chance for a candidate to energize both the party and the public. KLTV7's Michael Richardson spoke with UT Tyler's Ken Wink about the importance of a VP pick and the convention's potential impact.
After months of speculation, Ohio Senator J.D. Vance has been chosen as former President Donald Trump's running mate. The 39-year-old father of three was born in southwestern Ohio. He is the author of the best-selling book Hillbilly Elegy, which describes his upbringing. Vance also served in the Marines. UT Tyler professor Dr. Ken Wink thinks Vance may help secure several battleground states.
Let's face it, the critical states in this election are Wisconsin, Michigan and Pennsylvania. Maybe he helps some in the Midwest.
He says this criteria plays a key role in how Americans view the vice presidential pick.
We're reminded this weekend it's got to be somebody that the American people can see taking over as president if, God forbid, something should happen to the president.
In terms of stances, Vance opposes a national abortion ban, wants to finish construction of a southern border wall, and has repeated false claims that there was widespread fraud in the 2020 election. His running mate, former President Trump, arrived in Milwaukee yesterday. Trump says he rewrote his convention speech following the assassination attempt. Dr. Wink believes what happened can work to the Trump campaign's advantage.
He's got an opening to unify the country if he'll take it.
As the party gears up for a 4-month sprint to November, the convention's impact may linger.
The two things that parties want to do in these conventions is, number one, bind up the wounds that may exist in the parties. And then secondly, you're trying to mobilize your base to be excited about the party's chances in November in the hopes that you can increase voter turnout.
Michael Richardson, KLTV 7 News.
The Republican National Convention will run for 4 days. Former President Trump is expected to speak on Thursday.